Hello and welcome. Today we have a special episode today. I'm going to be interviewing someone that, if you've read the title, you already know, so I feel like that's a little bit cheating. But our guest today that we'll be talking about role-playing games with, story games, and all sorts of stuff is a tabletop role-playing games writer, blogger, and creative thinker known for the Congas.blog, which reflects on conversation games, game design, community, and the culture around the OSR and NSR. He curates and organizes events for a hub for independent fans, blogs, and publishers on Discord called the NSR Cauldron, and he's been doing it for nearly 4 years. He's designed micro RPGs like Ruinous, Squires Errant, and Ruins and Rogues, and he's accredited in a lot of the games I've written. Hello, it's Tim Beat.
Hello, thank you for having me. I should say it's not just me who handles the NSR Cauldron Discord. There's a great mod team there, but I definitely have been around a while, so that's probably one of the things I've contributed to the most. But otherwise, great introduction.
I hope I've covered all the bases. We have quite a shared history, I would say, as far as timeline goes on the internet. I think we've known each other for about 6 years, something like that. So in internet years, that's a long, long time. So just help me at first here remember our shared chronology. I think it started with Red Ink Adventures, something I published some time back, which is 6 years ago this month. But how did we come to meet?
6 years ago this month, geez. That was so Red Ink Adventures was a sort of combined hack of Maze Rats and Electric Bastion Land that you did. It had some really cool ideas of like using your three stats. I mean, in Electric Bastion Land, your three stats are sort of health pools, but Red Ink Adventures use the three stats as like different forms of armor for different kinds of attacks. But this is all kind of nerd stuff. I think, well, the whole podcast is going to be nerd stuff. I'm not sure why I'm qualifying that, but I think that it sort of unlocked for me what Electric Bastion Land was doing, because I had sort of tried to grok several times. Like, I was hacking the GLOG, the Goblin Laws of Gaming rule sets, and I kept seeing references to how much simpler Into the Odd was and Electric Bastion Land, those two games that are very tied together by the same creator, Chris McDowell. I didn't quite grasp it until, Sam, you put together this Red Ink Adventures, which I think the only reason it didn't catch on more broadly is that it only uses 1d6 for everything, and rolling 1d6 for
It's not as
everything
satisfying.
can feel kind of, yeah, kind of like a dead. It doesn't roll very well. It doesn't clack in your hands. I actually ended up. I remember I bought my first double six dice, which are D12s numbered 1 to 6 twice, thinking that maybe that would make Red Ink Adventures more fun. Um, I don't know. It didn't end up catching on, but it was the inspiration for uh, my first sort of published hack, which was Squires Errant, which was inspired by, I think mechanically more by Red Ink Adventures, but thematically more by Many Rats on Sticks by Skirples of Coins and Scrolls. I was trying to think of, how does it make sense for adventurers to exist in a realistic medieval fantasy society? And so I decided everybody is knights, and instead of paying a starting debt like in Electric Bastion Land, you're trying to pay your tithe to become a knight. And that was my very basic first idea for a game. I barely tested that game. I made a ton of versions, and when I first started hacking things, I did not quite understand the merits of playtesting. So a lot of those early experiments were kind of like, who cares if I test it? I'm just gonna make the thing.
Right, you're just gonna
Um,
gonna go for it, publish something, put it out there, right?
yeah.
Yeah.
And I don't even know if it's still. I don't think it's still on my itch. Sometimes I put it back up if I feel like I need to link it for something, and then I take it back down later because I have a bad habit of feeling ashamed of my old work. um,
You and
but
me both,
yeah.
man. That my itch page has so many of those, like, "Hey, I put this together on a Word doc. There is no layout whatsoever." And I've thrown it up on there, and then maybe somebody looks at it someday, but usually not. that's just the way it goes.
Yeah, but just to tie it back to how did we meet, I think you, ended up writing a review of Squires Errant on your blog, which was a well-trafficked blog at the time, and I assume it still is. And so I ended up getting, a number of clicks from that, and I think people were, I think that I still remember. I'll never forget Chris McDowell because that game Squires Errant was submitted to an Electric Bastion Land game jam, and Chris
Mm.
McDowell did a live stream where he looked through all of them. And he looked at mine for like, obviously he had to look through a ton of games, so I'm not like offended, but he looked at mine for like 30 seconds and said, "Oh, so it's kind of like Pendragon. Okay, moving on." And so I'm pretty sure I inspired Mythic Bastionland is
I
what
was
I'm
about to
saying.
say, little did you know,
Yeah.
you were the rock in his shoe that he carried
Yeah.
around all these years and thought, "You know what? Pendragon plus Electric Bastion, why haven't I done that yet? There was
Yeah.
someone else reminding me vaguely of that." Yeah, yeah, yeah. That's it. Everyone thank Tim for Mythic Bastionland.
Yeah.
Which gosh, Tim, have you seen just all of the hubbub? And I don't know, it's like every other week I see yet another review of Mythic Bastionland and all that kind of fun stuff.
I mean, Quinn's Quest really, I think pushed it into the
Yes, yes.
mainstream, and I think, I mean, that review was, in a weird way, it was like such a vindication of like, I mean, I've been in this community that has been in love with Chris McDowell's design sensibilities for years, and to see Quinn's, this sort of respected reviewer, give an exacting like summary of everything that's cool about it, and why Chris's
Mhm.
design is such genius, and having everybody just get it instantly, and like it's like the biggest RPG of the year now. It's very satisfying to sort of uh see that all come together.
Yeah, yeah, and it's fun too because he points out something which we've kind of circled around here just in conversation, which is the incestuous nature of all of these NSR OSR type games. I think he describes it as a bucket of crabs at the beginning of that review, and it's funny to me because you and I will talk about the advantages of using the three different stats and using some as armor and some as vitality pools and whatever else. And for us, there's a kind of joy in that and like looking at all of the differences in design. Do we do inventory? Do we just do bulky inventory? Do we do, slot-based inventory? Whatever. And for us, some of us can have a lot of fun like digging around in that and then just really uh, eye-opening and refreshing to hear reviewers say, "Yeah, these are all basically the same. I'm gonna tell you why this game is different." And to be kind of, I don't know, put in our place for, "Oh yeah, people play this game to play this game, not just to talk about all the fiddly bits that we love dissecting."
I have really, that is a huge thing, because some people reacted really negatively to that bucket of crabs comment, and I thought, I saw that and I was like, thank God somebody is saying it out loud, because like it really, it is like you can get, as a designer, you can get so obsessed with all the fiddly bits, and I just think that, like, I've started to think about like the games I make and the games I want to make in the future as like, okay, what am I providing to people uh, that isn't the rules? What am I
Mhm.
providing that has nothing to do with the rules? Because the rules nobody cares about. You can make the greatest, like slickest, best designed rules in the world, and nobody's gonna care unless you're really good at like convincing them and documenting your design process and like
Mhm.
explaining like why your decisions are such genius. And I think that's sort of few and far between. I sometimes say I think that people underestimate how much of, Cairn, for example, is just down to Yochai's charisma, and like
And
there
community building,
and
right? I
community
mean,
building, and because the design is important, and it's like the foundation, but on top of that, he builds this like confidence, by explaining so well, why the rules are better, and why they're a better foundation for your adventure designers, for your
mm.
players, and that confidence is what I think wins people over, just as much as the rules design itself.
Yeah, yeah, and it really kind of strips back a lot of that, And so actually, I don't know, this kind of segues pretty well into this post you had some time ago about the FKR, the Free Kriegspiel Revolution, and how some of designers are looking at some of the fiddly bits that we just talked about and said, you know what, I just want to focus on the world, or I want to focus on a given scenario. And you compared the FKR and this kind of desire to go back to, or maybe down, like strip down play to being like free verse poetry. So what's been your experience with running games that are kind of stripped back like this in terms of designing them, running them, playing them?
Well, first of all, I should say that the comparison to free verse poetry that I wrote, that was a blog post a few years ago that ended up getting shared by Ben Milton. So that's still, I think, one of my most popular blog posts. But the comparison was that in poetry nowadays, free verse is the default. And it wasn't for hundreds, if not thousands of years. All poetry was assumed to be written in metric forms. There were rules, in other words. And the comparison I was making to free verse poetry was that, maybe the direction we're headed in the future of role playing games is that the rules aren't going to need to be there anymore, and everybody's just going to have a sense of, if you just freeform role play with your friends, that's what role playing is. And you don't need all this structure because nobody needs structure in poetry anymore. Or rather, not as many people do. It's not the dominant form. I'm just gonna cough again for a second. I should have gotten water. um, uh, but I think that uh, playing in terms of playing and running and designing games in a sort of light style. Um, I mean, I think that there's a lot more experimenting I could do. I think that I've been sort of increasingly. I mean, you mentioned at the top of the show, Ruinous, which is this just sort of ashcan hack that's on my website right now. That is a version of Ruins and Rogues that sort of takes the dice rolling away from the players, which sounds like sacrilegious. But it is this idea of, well, what if only the GM rolls dice, and what if that is back in the hands of the GM? And I think that sort of I've been thinking more and more about how to pull the rules uh, away from the players. And I think that, people, I've been told that this is sort of a style in FKR that's can be called like black box,
Mhm.
where only the referee knows the rules. And that's not something that I really like have studied in any detail. But I understand that, I mean, it's something that I've been drawn to just sort of naturally, organically, because I think it goes back to what we were saying before about rules and how they don't matter. It's this sort of, I mean, the more I look, I mean, Chris McDowell himself has said that in his design, uh, he talks about the difference between clever rules and good rules. And this is one of the things that sticks with me is that you can design these clever rules, but and you can feel very good about them. Oh, I did this for example, in the early drafts of Mythic Bastionland, he designed he had a system similar to Cairn's inventory tracking system, where knights would take on burdens, and they would the burdens would sort of fill up their inventory, and they would have to do certain things to relieve those burdens. And he said, "Okay, I put all this work into this, and all of this is very clever." But there's already a system in the game, for, tracking, gaining, and losing stuff, and that's the ability scores. That's the ability score health pools that we were talking about before. So what if I just remove so he ended up just removing, the inventory tracking Cairn-style system for Mythic Bastionland, and it ended up being a much better game, even though that clever rule stuff was excised. And I sometimes look at that was a long preamble for I sometimes look at uh, the whole system itself of Into the Odd that's become so popular, that whole chassis. And I think there are some really clever bits in here about how you can get attacked by, an enemy might be turning you to stone or paralyzing you, and that attacks your dexterity, right? That lowers your dexterity score.
Mm,
And then you have to, in the future, when you make dexterity saves, in theory, that makes dexterity saves harder, and that's very impactful. And all that's very clever, right? But the more I sort of think about it, the more I think like, well, I mean, you're not even making rolls in Into the Odd that often in the first place. And these health pools are causing all these things that players have to get used to because they have to get used to roll under if they're coming from a more traditional D&D system where roll high is good. They have to get used to the strength and HP split, or in Mythic Bastion Land, the vigor and guard split, where they have two health pools. So there's all these and then that means that all the enemies have to have two health pools, or four health pools, depending on how you count. And it
mhm.
creates all this complexity that is very clever, and you can justify it. And I'm sure Yochai would uh, come up with great justifications for why all of this is great design. Because like I was saying, he's the charismatic, he promotes this stuff. But I just think that, what if we could go lighter than this? And what if all of this is a distraction, and uh we could have role playing that's more immersive and doesn't concern itself with all this stuff that gets in the way. I mean, something that I always am chasing is the kind of game that you can just uh, anybody can play, that you can rope your family, your friends
Mhm.
into, who have never played an RPG and aren't familiar with all these mechanics, and and you can do that with Into the Odd. I'm not saying you can't, but I'm always trying to get people into the game as painlessly as possible, and I just don't. I'm not always convinced that Into the Odd is as painless as everyone seems to think it is. Or rather, I think that, uh, what if we could do better? That's always what I'm thinking about.
Yeah, well, even the concepts within it, Into the Odd, about delving into a dungeon, there's so much that comes with it that this is the type of game you're playing. Whereas, how do I make a game that I'm able to be accessible to a cousin, a young cousin, or a mother, or a grandmother? Like, how can we make games that can track, has a kind of universality to it? Right, and I think that's at least part of my intuition for going to a simpler experience. I don't know if you have a similar thought.
Yeah, universality is sort of the word that comes to mind. I mean, if you looked through my notes, I have sort of lists in about what I think makes a game like universal and accessible. And I'm sure people would disagree with what I have written down. Yeah, so I have this list uh that's in my notes, and I have a ton of I keep a ton of notes on my iPhone, and just as the default notes app. But uh so I have popular enduring games are games that are social. You can play together. You can chase a score to try to beat other people, but they have that social element. They have uh, a universal element, which is like an abstract theme or a realistic theme, something that is like everyday from real life that everybody knows.
Mm,
And they have some element of like exercise, which could be like mental or physical, or it could be like a spiritual maybe exercise where you're growing somewhat. Playing the game, I feel like playing a game should always be uh I mean, in life more broadly, play evolved as this sort of way for young animals to learn how to hunt and learn how to. I'm probably butchering biology right now, but like I think like play has always has that element of like uh you want to enrich your life somehow.
well,
Uh
there's one piece that you had quoted, and I thought it was so fascinating because I've heard the Sid Meier piece on games, which is a game is a series of interesting choices, and there was one that you quoted, which was games are culturally complex play. I just thought that was so fascinating that it's a defining piece of the activity, but not reducing it necessarily to choice, like the ICI doctrine that I think about all the time may have us believe, right?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of debate about what a game is, but that's always been my favorite definition. That's from Greg Costikyan's Uncertainty. Is a book that he wrote. And I actually, Tom slash Lich Van Winkle put me onto that book, and it quickly became one of my favorite books on game design. Greg Costikyan is the designer of Paranoia and Tune, uh, classic RPGs. It is always just it's the only definition of game that makes sense to me because you can come up with all these criteria for like, oh, it needs to have a win condition or it needs to have choices or it needs to be like it needs to have rules, and then you can think of all these exceptions. But if you
Yeah.
boil it down to uh, it's play that is mediated by human culture because no animals can play, like, dogs play every day. I work with dogs, as my day job. I see them play every day. But they don't have culture. They can't, they can't argue about what the best way to play is, which is, of course, what I do every day is argue online about what the best way to play an RPG. I mean, that's sort of the fundamental. I mean, and even when we're talking about like, I keep bringing up Yochai and his charisma in promoting Karen, but that's a way of arguing about what the best way to play is. And I think I've said before that like I think that people don't recognize like how much that is part of the game. Like, without the conversation around the game, without all of those voices on YouTube, and podcasts like this one that are telling you, this is the right way to play games, you're not going to have as fun an experience. You're not it's not going to be as complete. Blogs are a huge part of what makes games, the kind of games that we play anyway, the games that they are, I feel like.
Yeah, well, there's the game itself, which is is played out, but then there's the conversation around it. So, for example, I just I just saw this video of somebody had like 8 AIs bots playing werewolf against each other, right? And then some of the comments were really funny to me because they said you're missing a key part of the game, which is the everyone's like talking about how badly the other players did, and they're just coming up with all sorts of excuses for why they play. But that all happens after the game, right? And so some of the play around some of these experiences that we codify as the game is a conversation around it, and doesn't have to be necessarily be 5 minutes after play. It could be, hey, you and I played a game. November of 24. We could still talk about that game, and it's still part of the game in a way, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's like I think everybody knows what you mean when you say the game. And there are times where that definition, where the sort of strict definition is useful. But then, if you just think about like all the things that go into it, and it sort of lives on, like games live on in a way, in conversation, about like, everybody when people remember like the thing I'm always chasing is when people remember something that happens in an RPG session and they still talk about it years later. Like that to me is sort of that game has had an impact on you and that's lived on in your memory. There's something about that I find really satisfying. I mean, that I'm sure we could all think of games that we've had that really have stuck with us like that.
Yeah, I mean, is that on your list as well? Like impact or some a bit of remembrance for it? Because yes, I think you're absolutely right. Where there are games that I play, and I put it down and I walk away and I leave the party or whatever, and I still think about, oh, wasn't that a great moment when so and so did this or had that ridiculous coup they were trying to get us and they just couldn't communicate well. Like thinking about games in that way. What else would you consider to be kind of a universal principle or part of games?
I maybe it should be on the list. I don't know. I mean, I think that like I mean, I just sort of look at like games like and I envy games like Tetris, like Pac-Man, like Minecraft, that are just so uh they just are so like you can grasp them instantly because they draw on either simple abstract concepts or real life idea. Obviously Minecraft is like this simulation of real life in
Hmm.
block form, and this sort of basic concept of struggling against the wilderness and like trying to uh, make a life out of it. It's like it's almost a fundamental human game in a weird way. And when you look at like dungeon crawler games, which we haven't really talked too much about, but that's like my unavoidable obsession. Is that every time I think I'm moving on from dungeon crawlers because of all these problems they have, I'm like, well, what if I could still make it work? Uh, and it's this thing where, like, because they have all these weird assumptions, that are drawn from, like, fantasy short stories that nobody reads anymore,
Mm.
or if they read them anymore, it's because they played the games first, and that they're going back to try to understand, well, why on earth does the game work this way? Okay, let me read some Jack Vance. Um, a and, it's like, I really envy that, uh that sort of that kind of game that just makes sense to everyone. And I don't think dungeon crawlers are that, and I don't know how to make them that or if they could ever be anything like that, but I'm still sort of thinking about it all the time, in the background.
Yeah, I mean that's kind of so. I'm going to allude to one of your most recent posts, which is about your rule of three, which is your three games that you found as fundamentally influential to your game design, the way you think about games. And the first one you have is a dungeon crawler, right?
Mhm.
So
Uh,
tell me about was it Many Rats on a Stick?
Many Rats on Sticks. The original version was Rat on a Stick. And then the subsequent was Many Rats on Sticks. It's a reference to I'm not sure anybody even knows this anymore, but, rats on sticks, as a delicacy, in Arnold Kay's world of Centera, comes up a lot, in old posts on his blog, so Skirples I guess thought that was funny and named, their glog hack, after that. But the Many Rats on Sticks is this fascinating, weird, dungeon crawler game that tries to, uh, model medieval society, uh, at the same time as it's reproducing like medieval fantasy tropes that it's trying to bind, in other words, like a sort of realism that you don't encounter in most fantasy games, onto the traditional, like totally unrealistic, like anti-medieval D&D fantasy setting that's really just a Western with knights.
I think there's something really interesting to the recent trend, I would say, in ascribing a kind of realism to our fantasy. I don't know if you're familiar with was it Delicious in Dungeon or Dungeon Meshi?
Uh-huh.
But, like, there's a whole section, actually the whole premise of the show is built on this kind of realism to a dungeon crawl of, like, what if we had to survive off the food that we find in the dungeon? And I don't know, there's something appealing, very appealing to the nerd mind that says, "Yes, I can finally somewhat ground my fantasy, and have it be something that has a little more weight or a little more heft to it, and, like, maybe even more of a spine, where there is some very definite problem solving we can do because we have more satisfying answers, right, to some of these questions.
Well, that's part of it. I mean, Skirples always says that I mean, the main thing that Skirples does when I'm talking about like crafting realistic society is enforce taxes, which in real medieval history, all land was owned by a noble. I mean, it all ultimately went back to the king. But if you couldn't just raid a dungeon on somebody else's land because there's no land that's free and unclaimed, right?
Mhm.
So Skirples institutes this idea of, well, you have to pay taxes to the person whose land it is, and you have to negotiate with your lord a sort of going rate for like how much of the treasure you're going to get to keep, or how much of it's going to be gifted back to you by your ruler. And it always seemed like so complicated to me, but it was also like Well, this like I mean, the way Skerples explains it is it creates a problem because maybe the players want to avoid paying their taxes. Maybe they want to solve find some other way to negotiate around this. And it creates like an interesting problem space for players to work in. And it's interesting that you mentioned Dungeon Meshi, because I know that's a big inspiration, I think, on His Majesty the Worm, or at least a lot of people say that His Majesty the Worm, that this other big RPG that came out this past year,
Hmm.
it's inspiration or feels like Dungeon Meshi in its realism. And there's a lot of many rats on sticks DNA in His Majesty the Worm that I'm not even sure most people are aware of because I don't know how many people still read Many Rats on Sticks. But there's a whole section in His Majesty the Worm on I think there's a paying taxes rule, and there's a whole section on the different estates and classes in society, the peasantry, the clergy, the nobility, the artisans. And it is that kind of uh, realistic take that and I mean, you're talking about, like, why does this appeal to nerds, right? Well, I think yeah, there is that element of, like, realism helps us ground ourselves more, but I also just think history is weird, and history is weird in a way that you can't really if you're just trying to be weird, if you're trying to be, like, nonsensical and funny and, like, random, you're not going to get as weird as actual history, because that there's all this, like, strange like Skerples if you haven't read the Coins and Scrolls blog, Skerples is a master of, just finding weird medieval texts and history and digging it up, and explaining they have this great post called Seeking Endarkenment, which is all about how if you really want to role play as though you're a medieval person, you have to like unlearn all of these enlightenment attitudes and ideas that are just like the air we breathe in the modern world. Uh, and you have to really get into this sense of like you don't think scientifically. You think in terms of like everything is chaos, and the gods and sort of spiritual like superstition is rampant and things like that. It's a fascinating post. I recommend anybody read it.
So it seems a lot of this game is about producing interesting problems. One of the big ways that they're doing that is by introducing obstacles that you wouldn't normally have, right? Like who opens Dungeons and Dragons and thinks, "Darn, I'm gonna have to pay taxes on all this stuff that I'm pulling out of the dungeon,"
Right? Yeah.
right? And then the other side is it seems like they're removing tools. So they're actively saying like one thing that you could do to make the problems of this world more interesting is to unlearn everything that you know, and that will create, yeah, more dynamic, more interesting problems, more just weird problems. But they're weird problems with a cause, right, and not arbitrary. Well, now you have to walk around on one leg because I said so, right? There are definite reasons, historical reasons, or attempting to take the fantasy and ground it onto something to like bolt it there to give it an actual reason for existing. And now you have, yeah, more interesting, more complex problems, I think.
Yeah, and richer, like, I mean, you're learning something too. You're almost like, I mean, going back to the idea of like games as exercising something, you're learning about history. I mean, I think that's something that I admire about it as well. Is that I mean, even just in hacking and trying to understand this game, I learned a lot more about how medieval history and society actually functioned. And now every time I watch like uh, a sort of medieval fantasy movie or show like Game of Thrones or whatever, like I get annoyed that there are no farms. That everything is just grass outside the city, and it's like everyone lived on farms. You don't understand. Like 90% of people were peasant farmers, and they just like don't exist in a lot of fantasy. Like it's just like nobles ruling over nothing. And it's this thing that really bothers and annoys me now because, that's I mean, I think I even read that, like, peasant farmers are, like, still, if you count it all up, all the people who have lived throughout history, the majority of people, who have ever lived were peasant farmers, and they get like no treatment in most media.
Yeah, right. It's largely ignored, right? And as a piece of the times that we set our faux medieval D&D games in, right?
Hmm.
Yeah. So this is one game that you really cut your teeth on. You said for designing games and to like I don't know, massaging through interesting problems, especially the traditional fantasy games and ideas. Like how do you make those come in alignment with more of a realistic world, but then also has a kind of complexity to the obstacles and problems that you're trying to solve. It's funny that you bring up coins and scrolls because I think when you submitted your rule of three, I said, "Wait, we have the exact same three games as being influential." I would just sub in Maze Rats for Many Rats on a Stick. But when you were talking through this, I realized a lot of the stuff I was reading while prepping this big Maze Rats campaign that kind of kickstarted my blog was Coins and Scrolls, and a lot of it was this kind of you have to pay your landlord, your lord, and you create interesting problems by having a relationship right out of the gate. So in Scorn, the first edition of Scorn, it was you have these districts that are ruled by different tyrants, and you owe allegiance to a tyrant just by living there. And so
Right.
they call you up and say like, "Hey, pay rent," and they make your life kind of difficult and horrible. And so that becomes a driving force for a lot of the problems. The second game you had on your list is one that uh, I think a lot of the comments you said around afterwards said like, I don't know if I would maybe it's too harsh on this game, but I think it's all warranted, and I think your love for the game kind of shows through, and that was Electric Bastion Land, right?
Yeah. I mean, do you want to sort of give preamble as to what I wrote about it, so I can sort of respond to my own harsh words?
All right, so the very first sentence is, "I hate that this game is on this list, but it feels unavoidable." Tim, defend yourself.
I just I have so many complicated feelings toward the game because it in some ways, we're talking about like a universal game that everybody can play, right? And in some ways, Electric Bastion Land, like on paper, seems like a great stride towards that because it is something that like anybody can grasp, like we live in a big city, and it's modern, and we have a lot of debt. Everybody has a lot of debt. Uh, and we have to go, I guess, into a dungeon and steal something. And that's the part that starts to get a little fuzzy, but it's like, all right, okay, we can do that. We can work with that. But the more you sort of get into the game for me, like, it just feels like it doesn't come together as a world, for me, and it never really has. It was always like I really like what this game is trying to do. I like how many, like, how the character options are all these weird items and abilities you can get that are all rooted in I mean the whole point of making it a modern setting was so that Chris could design all of these backgrounds that have or failed careers rather that have all these items that are from a modern world that people could recognize, right? And so the idea is that your problem solving brain, your lateral thinking brain can use more of what you've learned throughout your life because you live in a modern world and all of these different modern tools are available to you to problem solve with. And all of that feels great, except then the world doesn't make any sense at all. And it's all kind of like it's trying to do this like Kafka-esque, like nonsensical bureaucracy thing uh, and it just never quite comes together for me because you can sort of say, like, to your players, I guess, like, "Well, okay, anything that doesn't make sense, it's like it's bureaucratic, nonsense. The city is huge, nobody can map it because everything's always changing." That's the idea anyway. But then it's like, well, what's the basis for anything at all? It's the opposite in a lot of ways to Many Rats on Sticks, which is this game that gives you all this grounding that you normally don't have.
Right. Yes.
Electric Bastion Land has none of that grounding, and it it just sort of expects you to make it feel real all by yourself. and I could never like, there were just these little things that, like, so much of the modern world is, like, built on, like, the aftermath of, like, World War One, World War II, and there's this idea in the book that, like, Bastion is, like, it sometimes goes to war with itself, or, like, it goes into people from Bastion go into deep country and fight wars with each other. It's just very confusing. Like, it doesn't come to get because, like, why would the city do that? I don't know. Like, I don't know if that makes sense, but, like, it doesn't make sense to me. Like, what like, there's no, how does modernity evolve in this world, and, like, where did it come from, and, like, why is anything like this at all? I should probably let you talk because I'm rambling at this point.
No, it's good. It's like it's a game that it's very fluffy. It doesn't nail itself down on any particular point in history, right? Or even era of history. Like it claims to be somewhat 19th, somewhat 20th century, but we never get a real sense for what it is. And in that way, it's one of the best tools in the world for setting because one of the principles is everything is here. But then if everything is here, nothing is here. It's like this big, uh, complex Ouroboros eating itself. It's just like a huge dinner plate of blank paper. There's so much going on, and it's all sort of madness at the same time. But what it does so well is then uses that for introducing problems, right? So you start with the problem of having debt, and you start with the problem of being a loser, right? And then you have to make something of that. But I think you're absolutely right. In some ways, that level of complexity is so baffling, I think, in some sense, from both the GM side and from the player side. If you're not willing to like jump in there and just say, well, okay, fine. If I'm allowed to say whatever I want, then I declare there are Disney princesses and Warhammer 40K gods in this world, which there are, weirdly enough. I mean, if you look at like the addendum or the whatever the back part is, those a lot of those entries are inspiration from other pieces of media that he just threw in there.
Yeah.
And it's incredibly freeing and also incredibly terrifying to run because it is groundless. So I ran into this a little bit with I just put together a Electric Bastion Land supplement, and in it, I had this kind of framework for making these jobs and how these jobs come about, and made it kind of improvisational and very, I don't know, it's supposed to be a lot of banter and people making up problems as they go. But one of the things is for the setup to the game, I had to put a little like qualifier to this whole thing that was just said like preparation or something. And I said, you need to follow the procedures to make a map for Bastion, the city, like make a district. You need to make a section of deep country, and you need to make a section of the underground. Because my fear was someone would come into this game thinking they could just improv everything about Bastion by using this supplement, and then just realize they've run out of track and say like, okay, well, wait, where are we? And there's no sense of place or space or even people. It's just this big like mass of vibes that you've run into, and now you like it pulls you under and you can't escape. So in some ways amazing, in other ways terrifying as a game.
Yeah, and I'm not always convinced that, like, some of the procedures hang together that well anymore. Like, I think well, Mythic Bastionland has spoiled us, I think, is the
I
real
think so
story
too.
here,
Yeah.
because you look at the point crawl generation procedures, in for generating or for designing these sort of city maps, and deep country and underground maps, and they just never they don't feel as robust anymore. They feel like these very loose, prompts, that don't really I mean, your mileage may vary, but the maps don't really feel like a city to me. It feels like a dungeon map,
Yes.
that just sort of is supposed masquerading as a city.
Well,
Uh,
in some sense, it is the dungeon analogy is very apt because a lot of the city maps can feel like something you're supposed to traverse once in a way that many dungeons are traversed once because you have your different points of interest around the map of say Bastion, and you have a D6 encounter table, and then once you go through all of that, you're like, okay, is the city over? Is this district over? Have we done the district? but that's
Yeah.
not how cities work.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like you made a post, it was actually your post about how you would do the playing with youngers stuff over and playing with children
Yeah, 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 yeah,
over
yeah.
again, and you had that post where you said, "Well, I sort of if I wish there was a version of Electric Bastion that had, like, these more robust procedure." I forget exactly what you said, but, like, a depth crawl for the underground and, like, some other sort of procedure for the city and deep country, that you were referencing other games that have these more robust procedures for, these kinds of environments. And I really think that there is, like, a market for, like, an Electric Bastion Land Recharged, or remastered or whatever
Yeah,
you
yeah,
wanna
for
call it.
recharged is good.
But I think that if it added, like, some of the if it made it feel like Mythic Bastion Land and have all this, like, a all this scaffolding for, because the thing that it comes down to is when you design a realm in Mythic Bastion Land, it feels like you have everything you need to play. And I think when you design something for Electric Bastion Land, it just doesn't give you everything, at least in my view. It
Yeah.
feels like you have a lot more work to do, uh, in that game. I don't
Yeah,
know.
no, I absolutely agree. Again, the comparison between the new game and the old one, right, certainly brings out the foibles of the old, in a way that it shows us that, yeah, that we are spoiled in some sense. There's so many GM tools in Mythic Bastion Land. One thing I think about when it comes to Electric Bastion Land is I think it won an ENnie for, which was the GM advice, right?
Right.
So all the stuff in the back that maybe probably you and I have probably internalized, like things like the ICI doctrine, how to design traps, the way to run people and create problems, in a very Chris McDowell way. I think a lot of that is into the DNA of like the NSR, and I think that's where you kind of give credit to this game as being so influential, is because of a lot of that design thinking.
Well, I absolutely, and I think that it's definitely become the foundation for games that do other things because I think that, like, I wrote a blog post elsewhere that's sort of about the different paths you can take, to make a successful kind of OSR style game. And I wrote I had, like, there were 4 paths, A, B, C, and D, but I wrote that, Electric Bastion Land and Into the Odd are kind of like path D games where they're all about the design. And they're trying to convince people that the design is very good, but the thing about that kind of game is that people will just try to create the other kinds of games with it. They'll try to go back and make, it into D&D, or they'll try to give it a new they'll try to put a genre spin on it,
Yep.
and I think that's fine. Like, I think, at the end of the day, people are more interested in the genres they're familiar with, or a lot of people are anyway. But then I sort of come back and I think, like, I think back to our I guess the conversation we were having earlier in the show, which about, like, I think that still nobody has quite cracked, that puzzle of how do you just get everybody to grok, the dungeon crawl idea instantly and make it feel natural and make it feel not like this big, genre kind of thing because I think that Electric Bastion comes close, but then I think about my friend Max, who's another moderator, on the Cauldron server who says, like, "Well, yeah, but, like, if I were in a ton of debt, I wouldn't wanna go in a dungeon." That still doesn't make me wanna go in a dungeon. Like, like, I wouldn't wanna risk my like, I would just try to get a job.
Yes. Right.
Like,
Right.
it doesn't quite, like, bridge the gap, and I don't know if anything ever will. I don't know if the dungeon crawl is this inherently, like, thing, but yeah, that's still something I think about, that Electric Bastion Land, it kind of tries to tackle that problem. And I don't think I think nobody else is really interested in that problem, sometimes it feels that way. It feels like people just want they wanna make the pirate version, and they wanna make the cyborg version, and they wanna make the fantasy version.
Was the
Uh,
use of the word Borg intentional there? I feel like it was.
yeah, yeah, well, there's something like I mean, there's a I mean, every chassis, the Into the Odd, Foundation, the Morkborg Foundation, the
Yes.
D&D Foundation, they've all gotta have, You got to have one in every popular genre of sci-fi or fantasy or
That's right.
western or whatever it is. You've got to have one of each. And
Yeah.
and that always kind of, I mean, we're joking about it, but that always kind of bothers me because it's like, well, why should people have to be a fan of these genres to play these games? And maybe that sounds like a strange thing to say because like I feel like genre fiction is such a it's like a thing we live and breathe as nerds kind of, but I feel like it is a boundary for like ordinary people. Like I don't think, I think we sort of overestimate how much the average person cares about sci-fi or fantasy or superheroes or whatever it is. I think that there's like an audience for something that's more grounded in real life. Like I think about there's uh, a book that I read at a very formative time when I was in like the sixth grade called The Art of Game Design, that has this anecdote in it about it's a book by Jesse Shell. He's a well known game designer, but he talks about how when he was a kid he encountered this juggler who was like everybody could tell instantly he was the best juggler at this juggling convention, right? And he was doing these tricks that no one else was doing. And so young Jesse Shell, walks up to this juggler and asks him, "How do you how do you find your tricks?" And this juggler tells him, "Well, everybody else is copying everybody else. I copy nature. I copy the world around me. I design juggling patterns based on the flight of wild geese and things like that. Like it is this very like it's this very thing that's at like the core of who I am is like I took that advice and I'm like, yeah, that's what I want. I want a game that feels like uh, it draws not just from games that already exist, but from things where nobody is looking. And I guess that sort of bleeds into the final game on the final game on the Rule of Three list, doesn't it?
Absolutely, yeah, because I mean, you're alluding to a game that kind of, in my mind, breaks genre, and embraces physicality of scenario design. It's something I'm talking very abstractly about this, but the third game on your list, as you were talking about, is the social matrix games, which is something that on this podcast I've done a lot of legwork to showing people what actual play looks like around social matrix games, but you and I have tackled at this book and looked at it, and I think we've come to different conclusions about parts of it, but also it's been very influential, I think, in your thinking, especially how you've been addressing universality in your games and how you've been thinking about games that can um, I don't know, break the mold in many ways.
Yeah, and so the social matrix games, I mean, people who have been listening to this show already know what they're like. But they have this sort of ability to uh I mean the game you're not being immersed in a character so much as you're playing out this scenario the scenario with a bunch of different characters and you can you don't have to be bogged down by the minutia of like in an immersive sort of RPG kind of game, you have to think about like, well, okay, the players are going to be moving through space, and they're going to be like, what is the experience of one person in this story? Whereas with a social matrix game, you can do you can think more about the story as a whole. I mean, I'm sort of talking abstractly about this, but like to put it more concretely, like this scenario that I came up with that I've run for one NSR camp on the Discord server called Lull Astir is it started in my head as a D&D scenario, right? It started as here are all these factions that are in play that are arguing over, there's this guy who was a revolutionary and he's in exile, and he's sort of being protected by this monastery, uh, and the monastery doesn't want to give him up, but if they don't give him up, then there could be this big war. And at first I was thinking like, okay, then I throw some adventurers in, right, and they have to go solve the problem. And that didn't feel satisfying after a while, and I started to think like, "Well, why are the adventurers here at all?" because the interesting conflict is not the conflict between uh, the player character, these adventurers, and whatever monsters they're going to fight in the dungeon. The interesting conflict is between these factions. Uh,
Mhm.
and with a Matrix game, you just play as the factions. And that I mean that holds for both the sort of military style Matrix games that Chris McDowell originally did Sunrise Expansion based on. I'm sorry, I'm glossing over a lot of history very quickly, but it also holds for like social matrix games because you just play uh, as you can just say anybody can say at any time what any of the characters does. People can argue, people can disagree. If the disagreement stalls the game, you can roll dice, but you really don't have to. And you just sort of tell the story together. And to me, that ended up being a lot more interesting than the dungeon framework, and it felt a lot more going back to what I was saying, like, it felt a lot more true to life. It felt like it didn't have, this dungeon crawly genre expectation bolted onto it, and it feels like so far, and I still have to work on it, it's still in development, before I release it on itch, but it's so far, it feels like something that anybody can grasp and get something out of, and that's what really excites me.
Well, it's so interesting because the way that you came at this wasn't from a, "Here, I'd like to design a game. Here's how I'm going to do it," and then, "Oh, I guess I gotta come up with an adventure or some sort of content to like, make this real, to make this an actual playable thing." You came at it from a, "I have a scenario in mind. The current mold that I have for addressing problems through throwing adventurers at them, right? An adventuring party go solve this problem isn't doing it. So found a different framework that says play the scenario instead of playing an individual character and being have a GM player character relationship. It was we're all going to address this together, and there's not necessarily a shared turn order or specific rules on who can say what at what time, that kind of stuff.
Yeah, and I'm starting to worry that any scenario I might come up with for a dungeon crawler might be more interesting if I just let people play as the factions and skip the adventures. Like I'm still trying to figure out like, is there anywhere where adventurers come in for me that is fun and interesting still because it's so like it's so baked into me at this point over the years of like thinking about dungeon crawlers. But like it also like when I think of like okay, I want there to be an interesting conflict in the town, and I want there to be like some social element of like forces and conflict, and it's just like oh man, that's so much cooler than just going and like I don't know, like casting fireball on a bunch of orcs or whatever. Um, and you're saying, to get back to like you're saying, I'm coming at it from a different angle than you are. I think you're coming at it more from the angle that Chris Engel's book actually does, because we're sort of skipping over the book Social Matrix Games, that really uh, expounds this sort of style of Matrix games where there's no turn order. It resolves in a few hours. Randomness is sort of limited to sort of serious disagreements. That this style, there's no referee, that kind of thing. Um, I think that, and it gives all these examples of like Robin Hood or like just familiar like public domain stories that like oh let's everybody play a game in this style, and you're sort of taking that with this show and doing like I guess like the whatever generation we are version of it, where it's like cartoons from when we
Sure.
were kids, and like I'm coming at it from this totally different angle of like, and it's not that I don't like I like, but I ran a Matrix game that was like a Steven Spielberg mashup, and you were part of that.
Yep.
And I liked what I learned from that is that I liked the format. I love like playing a scenario, but I didn't quite like how uh for lack of a better word, like how frivolous it all felt. Like I wanted there to be something more serious and more dramatic about it. And I feel like that's sort of where I'm heading, is this sort of like,
Hmm.
I mean, I described Lulla Stir as this kind of like Shakespearean almost, like it's not like going for the Shakespearean, like, high poetic language, but it's going for that sort of dramatic, like I mean, the one playthrough I ran of it for the NSR camp was, like, it ended up being, like, a very tragic story, and I was very happy with that. Like, like, the character who is under protection of this monastery ends up dying because he ended up getting overconfident about his little revolutionary plans, and you know it felt very sad, and that's kind of what I liked about it.
Yeah.
You know, it's this expression, like I'm trying to express something through it, and I feel like that might be the thing that gets over that gap of like you know, how do we make these things, these games that we play, more universal and more accessible, and so anybody can play. I mean, we haven't even really addressed like, you know, with an RPG, you have to roll up a character, you have to have some idea of who your character is, and you have to prepare a whole dungeon. Whereas with social matrix games, you can just sort of give everybody a very short brief of who the characters are, and what the situation is, and you just make it up, and that's all you need, and it's so much more freeing, and accessible, and you know, you can get anybody to play, and I feel like I feel like I more than I expected, we've sort of uh had an arc in this conversation where we're sort of building more and more towards that ideal.
Yeah, and it's again, I like that you are coming at this from a different angle because it's something that with your picks of Many Rats on a Stick and Electric Bastion Land, we have kind of some of the similar influences, but you have more of a, I would say, historical mindset for how large groups interact on a large scale, and I think it's very different from what I'm doing with the story games side and like as you said like using this as a platform for playing out cartoons and like cartoon fan fiction almost on that terrible level, but you're doing something that is this, we're taking the same similar sources and kind of the same ideas, and you're going to a completely different area of play, and I really love that. It speaks to me the universality of the flexibility of these rules and these ideas, which is you're just doing a scenario. The scenario could be Saturday morning cartoons. The scenario could be, a monastery out in faraway land, or it could be something very real. And there could be very grounded. I just love that because we're two different people, we got two different ways of coming at these ideas. And I love that it's producing this kind of play that you're finding satisfying and exciting.
Yeah. Yeah, no, it's great. I mean, I want to experiment more with it. I wanna make more. I mean, you're talking about, like, modern, like, right now, Lulla Stir is still very medieval, and it sort of comes out of all the medieval thinking that I've been
Yes.
doing since Skirples. But I still like, I wanna do stuff that's, like, set in the modern world and, like, has that, dramatic bent. So I'm very excited to see what the future holds in terms of that.
Yeah, I mean, so the Social Matrix game book, Chris Angle had, as you said, all of these examples of play, which I think is something that's really powerful to describing this particular genre of game because it's so it is very abstract and it needs some sort of grounding for people to see what the games actually do, which is why I've largely done an actual play series on this show, and it's to demonstrate how these things work, and they need a bit of explanation, which is, I mean, Chris Engel in his book says, not for lack of trying, but these games aren't commercially successful in any way. So I'm wondering if there's a way that we can synthesize your four paths to a successful OSR game and the desire to create a game that would be commercially successful with the social matrix game kind of flavor to it. What does that look like? If I could pick your brain on that.
I mean, if I knew how to make a commercially successful game, I wouldn't be living with my mother at 27. But
You wouldn't be talking to me either, Tim, and you
I
know it. So I'm.
but I think that, I mean, my sort of gut answer is like, how do we, like, how do we talk about this? I mean, I think that it's a matter of like I think that Chris Angle's book is like a good starting place because it's just laying out a ton of scenarios that you can play and that anybody can pick up and play. And I think that if we had like if we sort of thought of it less as like we're releasing one scenario at a time and more like we're releasing like a bunch of scenarios, I think that might be more uh one way to think about like a more successful product. I mean, I think providing more tools for I don't know, not even referees for people to play with
But yeah, host the game. Yeah.
for the host. Yeah, the host. Thank you. I think that that's a place to start. I also think that having a good like thematic through line. And I think I mean making more interesting scenarios in and of itself like that's more attractive and like making them more complicated. I think that like word of mouth needs to spread to a certain degree. Like just like we're talking about like how much a big part of games culture is people talking about games and explaining why they're fun and explaining like why you should play a certain way and like games are these is culturally complex play. We need that culture to spread. And I think that there are there are games that sort of model uh something similar, if not exactly close to what Social Matrix games are doing. I think Yazeba's Bed and Breakfast is
Hmm.
this sort of running, and it's funny because it evolves from like the sort of powered by the apocalypse Forge tradition, but it has a lot of similar DNA where as far as I understand, I mean there are tokens involved and there's sort of more mechanics, but you're basically playing through a long running story with characters, and you not you don't have to have one player playing one character. You can play whatever character you want. Um, and there are other like belonging outside belonging games in general bear a lot of similarities to what social matrix games end up being just with those token mechanics. And I think that there are things we can learn from that. There are things that we can there are places where we can do things differently. But I think that there is there's something that can be built here in this space. And I think that it's going to take a few years probably, but I think that it's possible. And I think that like I think a lot of it is going to have to be not just like making a product for like one person makes a product and sells it, but also like encouraging people to make their own scenarios too, right? Because I think the more we sort of uh I mean, the appeal of a social matrix game is that anybody can write a scenario, and it's
Hmm.
relatively easy. And I think it's going to look different from the RPG market, where it takes a certain amount of skill to write an RPG, and so there's a sort of divide between the people who play and the people who design. And I think that that divide is going to we're not going to see that as much. But those are just some initial thoughts on how it might end up looking.
Yeah, it's so odd because this design space, as you alluded to, has uh infinite accessibility, right? Like I could write a scenario and have written a scenario on a napkin and say, this is what we're doing. We're gonna do Scooby Doo, and here's the problem. Boom, go. And it could go that direction, or it could be a more original setting, like the bed and breakfast game, and have these original characters to it. There's a lot of thought behind how each of them have interplay and the different arcs that they could undergo, but there's also a lot of art and a lot of aesthetics that all go towards this being a successful game. I think these are all things that could be incorporated there. I just think the mold is broken for a social matrix game when it comes to the accessibility that anyone could design or run or play any of these games. So I think it has strong potential. It just may come down to someone being able to explain it better than I can, or you can, and creating a game that is has a lot of heft to it and a lot of a good heft, right, and draws people in. So maybe that's what it takes. But again, it's so interesting to think about.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I don't know what it's gonna look like, but that's kind of the exciting thing, right? Is that it could look like anything for all we know.
Right. It's not. Yeah. It's not going to be a another. Oh, I tell you what, it's not going to be. It's not going to be another Dungeons and Dragons clone.
Yeah, that's for sure. Someone will try though. Someone will
Someone
try
will
to turn
try.
it back into Dungeons and Dragons
Right. 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 Right.
once
Right.
we
Yeah.
make the new thing. There's always somebody. I think Chris McDowell made the same joke once where he was talking about he did a stream about 2400.
Yeah.
And there was this great joke where he was like, okay, so somebody invents this great new thing and everybody gets so excited about it. And what's the first thing they do with it? They say, what if we made D&D? And then he pulls up 1400.
Yes.
Like, and it was that I think about that all the time. That's
Yep.
still lives in my brain rent free.
Ouroboros keeps coming back, eating itself, and we just keep making the same odd games. So, again, I hope this is something that breaks that, and we go in a completely different direction with this. I think one of the weird things, Tim, with this is that you're not playing a singular character. And I think that's something that makes this game so interesting is that you don't need to be, in one character's head. You could be thinking about the whole cast and or a whole faction like what you've been doing. And I don't know, there's a lot of potential there. And I'll end with this with your personal development into Social Matrix game and the Lol Austere, all this you have going on. What is something that you hope for the design of this game and you hope for, what this does, what kind of impact this has?
Um, I mean, I hope it's the start for me to build toward. I guess sort of something that we're describing is like something that combines uh both a product that like I can put together and like like a book of scenarios that would be amazing, but also like more of a community that is like interested in playing scenarios like this and developing them and sort of developing richer experiences. And I think that is, to bring it all back to the beginning, like if we're talking about games are culturally complex play, like I think we need to talk about building a culture around these games, right? A culture of social matrix games, because it seems to me like I know Chris Engel has apparently been doing this since the 80s, but like there's not really like. I mean, we've discovered this. You and I mean, you discovered it. I stole your discovery.
Oh, no, 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 no. I was sent a book from
You were
Chris.
sent a book. That's
So
true.
there's no discovery involved here. This was thrown on my lap.
This was thrown, but I mean, I think that there's like a lot of ground to like for people to take this thing and run with it and turn it into something. Who knows what it becomes when it touches. I mean, we're already seeing like Matrix games, like the original Matrix games with the turns and the referees being embraced in a whole new way with over under and cataphracts. And that's sort of becoming a big thing right now. So and that's transformed completely. Like people are role playing online, like as all these different characters all at once. And it sounds like it was an amazing experience. I wasn't a part of it. But like what happens to social matrix games once a whole community of people embraces them? I think we have no idea. And that's very exciting to me.
Course, we always end with some optimism. So, Tim, it's been great talking with you, man. This is fun. I don't know very many other people who are writing and thinking about telling stories in a way that does not fall to the same dungeon crawl experience or even just the adventure game experience, which is to go out and to do something big and bombastic. It could be faction interplay and kind of this scenario design problem solving that we're just not used to seeing in the OSR and even NSR spaces. So thank you so much for the conversation. Where can people go find more of your stuff?
Yeah, so right now, really just congas.blog. That is the main place. I've been trying to post more stuff recently. My latest post is sort of a lore thing about magic and like trying to think about how Vancian magic might manifest in world in a way that's like not just doesn't just feel like this abstract thing, but like feels like a thing that evolved over time. And yeah, you can find me at the NSR Cauldron Discord server. It is my home on the internet. I love all the people there. We're going to turn voice channels on for the holidays over January 2nd through 4th. So if you want to come talk to me or anybody about any of this stuff that we talked about in this podcast, then I'll probably be there for at least part of the time that the voice channels are open.
Awesome. Again, Tim, thanks you for coming on, and thanks for building a community on the NSR Cauldron. It's again fun to be a part of, and to just even stop in occasionally and listen to what all interesting design discussions are happening around there. So thanks for that, and thank you for listening, and hope you have an awesome day. See ya.